Good afternoon. It's Friday, the 15th of June, 2018, just after 1 o'clock. Apologies for the slight delay. Welcome to UK Column News. Your host today, Mike Robinson, myself, Brian Gerrish, and we're also joined by David Elliott and many apologies there. There might have been a family name crapped out. Ellis, David Ellis, and David Scott from north of the border with Northern Exposure, of course. David Ellis, we'll bring you straight in because, of course, you have been immensely accurate on matters defence. And we've reported a while ago about what was happening with Rolls-Royce. You mentioned that the Chinese the Chinese Dragon was loitering in the background. And then yesterday, when we did a report, unbeknown to us while we were live, this story emerged that somebody had been selling secrets to the Chinese. We actually picked up this morning from this one that Bryn Jones is the gentleman concerned. I believe that he denies having done anything wrong, but the story says that he's being investigated by the counter-terrorism police. And MI5 has appeared. I'm afraid I couldn't resist putting that MI5 has arrived after the horse has bolted. But what's your take on what's happening to Rolls-Royce?
Well, they're extremely vulnerable, aren't they? I mean, the internal chatter from the senior management team is that they're ripe for a takeover. They seem to be busily engaged in shortening their own position under some guise or auspice. The announcements that were made were far greater than what was anticipated, even by the people doing the cutting. And ironically, the people doing the cutting are themselves going to get made redundant. So it's a bit like assassins being assassinated. But nonetheless, it doesn't change anything. The company's being sold short. So the big cheese really is what the government's going to do with its golden share. And it's the same kind of arrangement as what they've got with BAE. So if there is to be a takeover, it's how that's going to be handled and who's going to be doing the takeover. So ironically, a lot of the chatter we were picking up was that China was going to be the bidder. It may well be that that's not the case. There could be other people involved. At the supranational corporate level. So we've all got to just sort of withdraw from the kind of perspective of our politicians and our nation having much bearing over this. It's being done at a far higher level at the supranational corporate level. So, maybe it could be a conglomerate of America. I mean, who knows? It could even be the Russians want to buy it via a frontage group, similar to what they've done elsewhere. So looking at this cover story with the man leaking stuff to China, allegedly, is this guy on his own? Other people been doing this? And if other people have been doing it, and who to? I think probably the irony here is really all around the engines, is what Rolls-Royce has been doing with sending engines into kit form into Iran, and where they've been going from Iran. Could they have been going into Russia and China? There's some irony for you, isn't it? But they were certainly going somewhere. Yeah. And we've got Lockheed there in America making effectively the F-35, which is a copy of a Russian project. So it's all a bit full circle at that end, isn't it?
Take all of those points. I'll just say it seems to me the key point is that we've now got decisions being made, national strategic decisions are being taken, not by our government in Westminster, but by these immensely powerful global corporatist organisations. And it seems to me that if Rolls-Royce is to be collapsed in this country, sold off to Lockheed Martin, perhaps, British Aerospace is then going to follow. And essentially our nation's defence is out of our control. What is left of it is now in the hands of corporatists.
That's completely correct. And I've been saying this to sort of senior officers over the last couple of weeks while we've been, watching this unfold, since, a few people blowing the whistle in Rolls-Royce, is that really, actually, at the military end, at the British military end, Navy, Army, Air Force, etc., the military union or unification gambit, which is currently being sort of washed with all these cozy words like a deep and special partnership, actually becomes academic. because at the manufacturing, at the corporate end, if there's unification, well, clearly there's something going on at Rolls-Royce, and let's just say, for the sake of argument, that it is going to be unified into a bigger company. Then the military unification at the other end of the spectrum, and I've always said this since we've started this campaign, is the industry and the military have to be treated hand in glove. So that being so, is that the military union becomes totally academic. It's almost a sort of a given, because if there isn't national manufacturing, there isn't any national perspective, and this is something I took up with Robert Fry, ex-CGRM, is that when he spoke at DEFCON, he kept saying as a nation in his evidence, and I'm picking him up. He said, well, that's the problem, is we're not doing this as a nation, and the MPs are not acting as a parliament. Parliament isn't functioning. Everything is being done outside of Parliament and not at the national perspective. So, Brian, I couldn't agree more. I mean, you've actually got totally 100% correct.
Okay, David, thank you very much for that. We know you're very tight for time today, so we will say thank you for that analysis. We will bring you back when you can to go into this a bit deeper.
Okay, let's move on to, Russia. And of course, Brian, the World Cup kicked off yesterday with Russia playing Saudi Arabia. Russia won. But the BBC, of course, had to send their top journalists over there to cover this. This is Nick Robinson from the Today programme. He had a little panel of young Russians that he was speaking to this morning. He had a couple who were allegedly pro-Putin, but really, what was the point of his presentation? He was trying to sort of build a picture of a Russia where perhaps you couldn't speak out too much. Let's have a listen.
Men like the opposition leader Alexei Navalny, who was thrown into prison, again, just before the football kicked off. He succeeded in getting people, particularly the young, onto the streets, not just here in the Russian capital, but in cities all over Russia. And the young are particularly incensed by the Kremlin's recent crackdown on their use of social media, an attempt to ban a widely used messaging service, Telegram, valued for keeping messages secret from the authorities. So I've been speaking to a group of students here in Moscow, a Navalny activist called Kate, a liberal called Gelib, and two who are rather more sympathetic to Vladimir Putin. Do you feel, Yelena, you can talk about politics openly at Moscow State University?
Of course, I can talk about politics, but I don't do it very often. Authors like Machiavelli, they advise to keep silence,
because?
Especially for women.
What would happen if you were not silent?
Maybe nothing, but it's better to keep silence, I think.
So she went on to talk about her friend who had ended up in prison for speaking out against Putin, and this was the sort of narrative that was being built here. And I just thought to myself, Brian and David, once again, the hypocrisy of the BBC is unbelievable. Because if we look at what's going on in this country, of course, we've got headlines like this: be careful with social media, employers are watching. So you cannot speak out on social media because you're going to lose your job. And even the BBC has covered this. Here's a BBC article: I lost my job over a Facebook post. But of course, Nick Robinson there making the point that people were ending up in prison for using social media. That wouldn't happen in this country, would it? Well, yes, it would, because as the Independent pointed out, arrests for offensive Facebook and Twitter posts soar in London. And if we listen to the narrative from Theresa May and the British government over the last 6 months, and also Matt Hancock, it's pretty clear they want to start putting people into prison for their use of social media and so on. And the other thing that Nick Robinson was talking about there was Telegram, and the fact that the Russian government is getting pretty jittery about the use of Telegram. Now, the Russian government's concerns about the use of Telegram are because the NGOs that are operating in Russia are making use of Telegram. And of course, this is difficult for the Russian government then to keep a track of what NGOs are doing. It is, I understand this is a tricky situation, but anyway, Telegram is in the Russian sites, but it wouldn't be in the sites of the British government, surely, would it? Of course not. Theresa May's repeated calls to ban encryption still don't work, but the point is that she is dying to get her hands on Telegram, on Signal, or even on WhatsApp, which is full of holes. but you know, the determination of this country is to shut down social media and shut down encryption because they want to know what we're all doing.
Yeah. The BBC, Mike, the hypocrisy is absolutely breathtaking. I wonder whether we just pop to the very last slide, number 47, just to add it into this one.
Well, I can, yes, if you want to keep
talking. Because somebody kindly sent through to us today some comment from BBC Media Action, and this is a man called James Deane. And if you have a look at what he's talking about, basically he's saying how he's been helping policy, he's been helping to inform thinking, policy and practice. And then later on, he's posting on the faults, fissures and connections between media development and social and behaviour change communication. So this is the outrageous so-called BBC charity, BBC Media Action, which boasted of its ability to help push for regime change in Syria. And here is this man crowing that this organisation is going to help us change our behaviour. The hypocrisy is utterly breathtaking. I think we should probably bring in David Scott at this point, because I'm really lost for words, or not.
Well, let's have a little look at a recent BBC headline. Man fined for hate crime after filming Pug's Nazi salutes. This is Count Dankula. And the BBC eventually reported it. A man who filmed a pet dog giving Nazi salutes before putting the footage on YouTube has been fined £800. And it goes on to say he denied any wrongdoing, but he was sentenced to Sheriff Court after being found guilty of committing a hate crime. And you know, there was nothing from the BBC about freedom of speech. There was nothing from the BBC about social media being used as a means of government oversight of the population, of policing how people think, of policing how people communicate. You know, they were entirely silent on all of these issues. It seems that they can see the beam in the Russian eye, but not anything in their own.
Well, absolutely, that is true. But and let's stick with NGOs, because Sergei Lavrov, increasing concern over NGOs operating in Russia. Attempts to influence our policy stance, foreign and domestic, are futile, he said. Our country can protect its sovereignty and citizens' rights under any circumstances, no matter what the BBC says. And I'm not suggesting that there, you know, some of the actions being taken by the Russian government aren't quite extreme, but this really is the hypocrisy, because the exact type of behaviour increasingly happening in this country, Brian. But the Russians understand, of course, that the world that they're operating in is one where there are Western-backed NGOs operating to try to undermine their government, and that, of course, is something which isn't happening in this country, no matter what Theresa May might say.
Yeah, well, BBC, we better move on, because I think we'll really get to the appropriate vocabulary, which of course is not allowed on UK column.
Well, indeed. Right. Now, let's move on to the issue of children. Well, I was given a clue about this event, which apparently has not been publicly, this has not been made public today, but this is No Child Left Behind, Families Not Institutions, and this is the EU External Action, allegedly championing children's rights. It's in collaboration with Lumos, which claims it's protecting children and providing solutions. And of course, Lumos is the organisation established by J.K. Rowling. So J.K. Rowling taking part in this event herself. She's taking part both in the No Child Left Behind section of the programme, and also in the final summing up at the end. Other areas they're looking at is strengthening child protection systems around the world, the human and financial costs of institutionalization. So this is really fantastic stuff, Brian. It's being held at the European Commission, and of course the EU and the European Commission absolutely determined to get to the bottom of child abuse, child trafficking, except when they're not, because here we are, the Against Child Trafficking.org. This organisation has published an open letter from Against Child Trafficking to the European Parliament, again highlighting the fact that they refuse to deal with the evidence which Rolly Post in particular has been pushing forward about child trafficking and child abuse through the European system.
And I just remind people that's Rolly Post, who wrote a book called Romania for Export Only.
Absolutely. So this letter says, Dear President Tajani, yesterday I received documents under a regulation in relation to correspondence between the European Parliament and Eurodapt regarding the collaboration of the European Parliament's Milan office and Eurodapt. Now, actually, Eurodapt is one that I haven't heard mentioned in relation to Brexit. We'll have to have a look into that and see. But anyway, the letter goes on. It turns out that Eurodapt violated the rules and procedures of the European Parliament. And he talks about Amici dei Bambini. We've talked about that organisation on this programme before, and allegations that it's involved in child trafficking. And the letter here says Amici dei Bambini was expelled from Eurodapt 2018 conference by the Italian authorities. This was the result of the documentary The Traffickers, The Dark Side of Adoption, which exposed child trafficking in Congo committed by Amici dei Bambini. That documentary, The Traffickers, is well worth tracking down. Do have a look at it. I would like to remind you, the letter says, of the whistleblower letter of Mrs. Post that we handed to you over the legal advisor. That we handed over to legal advisor and then President Schulz in February 2016, and to which no reply was given. Mr. Droid told me that he felt the European Commission was using the strategy of scorched earth, destroying any evidence of their aiding and abetting the traffickers. I would therefore like to hear what the European Parliament can do for a European Commission whistleblower. The issue which you call controversial is in fact simple child trafficking and definitely a violation of all EU values. ACT has over the years researched the practices of various Eurodapt member agencies and exposed them for child trafficking. Further, hereby I request that you initiate an inquiry into the dealings and wheelings and dealings of the former S&D leader Patella and MEP Kienge concerning the adoption of children from Congo. So this organisation, headed up by Arun Dole, keep an eye on it, because they are doing spectacular work to try and expose the activities that are going on under the watchful eye, shall we say, of the European Parliament and the European Commission, with apparently no action being taken. David, I don't know if you've got any thoughts about this, but the fact of the matter is that Rolly Post has been trying to get the lid off this issue for, well, what is it, about 10 years
at least. Yeah.
And we see the same type of intransigence from the authorities in this country to actually look at this issue and deal with it.
Quite, and that's a very encouraging campaign you're highlighting there. I see the Lumos charity you mentioned before. Their logo is, or their byline is, "Children belong in families, not orphanages." Well, that's a sort of idea that on the surface we could all get behind, but of course there's more to it than that, because the children who are ending up in orphanages are not orphans. There's something else happening here, and it's interaction with the state, and it's the state acting to decide who has children, who does not. So you mentioned earlier on that we don't have Russian non-governmental organisations infiltrating every aspect of our society and changing how we think. Indeed, we don't, but we do have Western non-governmental organisations doing exactly that. Charity after charity, a great many of them to do with children, a great many of them co-located in single buildings, it would appear, including one in Edinburgh, and a great many of them benefiting from government funding. And this is changing how people view the world. That's the purpose, and it's changing how people view children. So it's very good that we're seeing some organisations fighting back.
And of course, you mentioned the children shouldn't be in orphanages, they should be in families. Well, of course, the thing that Rolly Post was really highlighting was the fact that children were being taken out of orphanages and being sold into families. So we perhaps see something in that in that particular tagline. Now let's move on to Wales, and I just wanted to highlight this case. I'm sorry the headlines dropped off this Wales Online article here, but this is a police inspector who was part of a South Wales paedophile ring. You notice that we're not talking about rape gangs here, we're talking about paedophile rings. There seems to be, in certain circumstances, we don't want to use the stronger language for when we apply to these types of people. But anyway, this guy was regularly meeting online to discuss how they could abuse children under 13. This is the first case of its kind in South Wales, the report says, and this is a gent called Geraint Evans from Barry. He was formerly stationed at Bridgend Police Station, and he admitted conspiring to incite engagement in unlawful sexual activity with a child under 13. He, of course, is no longer with South Wales Police. He also admitted to possessing more than 170 extreme pornography images, including bestiality. But what fascinated me was what his job was in South Wales Police. So I tracked down this document here from Gwent Police, baseline assessment from October 2008. And here on the right-hand side, we can see good practice, Newport BCU, a strategic approach to tackling prostitution. And what we find is that this very gent was in fact involved, leading the police action on prostitution and trafficking. And so this, Brian, would have put him in a very powerful position. Yeah. Yes. So this is not something we've seen this many times before.
Well, it's obvious that it's been happening, but it's encouraging to see that this has come up to the surface now. But it is obvious, and we're going to show you another example of how the police have been colluding and are continuing to collude in order to cover up child abuse. And if you say, why would they do that? There can only be one answer, and that's because they're involved in it. So, David, I know you want to come in. Let's just get through this little segment very quickly. Rochdale, Rotherham, no change. What we're talking about is a court case which is ongoing, so we've got to be restricted in what we say. But the nub of it is child has been abused. The mother's tried to protect that child from an abusive father. The evidence exists on video, audio, there are photographs, and there's transcript, all showing the abuse of this child. The evidence is not being looked at by Yorkshire Police, the family courts. Well, in fact, the judges refused to allow that evidence into court. The local authorities are turning a blind eye. The child protection teams are turning a blind eye. And as we're about to show you, it now appears that the Police and Crime Commissioner is turning a blind eye. So let's bring in the man himself. This is Dr. Alan Billings. He made headlines in a big way because he was re-elected. People liked him so much they re-elected him. And he's an unusual man because he's an Anglican minister who's also involved in policing. Well done, Dr. Billings. This is part of their recent report, Keeping People Safe. I'm continuing to ask the police to protect vulnerable people from threats. Well, one would have thought that a child being abused was one of the most vulnerable people in society, but it gets more complicated. So let's have a look at how the documentation stacks up. Now, this is a reply from South Yorkshire Police and Crime Commissioner's office to a gentleman called Mr. Brighton. Mr. Brighton is the man who has been pushing the evidence of the abuse of this child to the authorities, and they simply reject it. They refuse to look at it. So what does the Crime Commissioner's office say in this email? Thank you for your latest response. As per my email to you of the 17th of May, you are not the complainant in this matter, and therefore I'm unable to share any information relating this case with you. I would strongly advise the complainant to bring any concerns they may have to the attention of the officer in the case, who will progress these where appropriate and necessary. Well, this is an enormous smokescreen because, of course, Mr. Brighton wasn't asking for information. He had been providing the evidence of child abuse. In addition, he was reporting that the police were refusing to investigate that evidence. So a complete smokescreen by the caseworker here. Mr. Brighton replied, I'll just take you through this very quickly. He says, Dear Alan Billings and Stephen Watson being the Chief Constable, advising that the evidence be presented to the officer that is both incompetent and is covering up the child abuse demonstrates institutional corruption. Who provides you with video and sound recordings of child abuse is irrelevant. What matters is that children are being abused. You have received the evidence of a father threatening to slit the throat of his son like a cat, abusing the son for the entertainment of the uncle, admitting stealing the victim's phone, and admitting lying to the police, using revenge porn, blackmail, theft and fraud, normalising sex acts by giving 2 young children age-inappropriate sexual material. All these are crimes. Where the video and sound evidence comes from does not matter. What is important is that the police are doing nothing whatsoever. Therefore, all evidence can now be freely published with a tag showing that neither the Police and Crime Commissioner nor South Yorkshire Police are, quote, fit for purpose. Those that fail to act appropriately when faced with child abuse or condone in any way, even by doing nothing, the actions of the child abusers become, by definition, child abusers themselves. Using the above definition, South Yorkshire Police and the Officer of the Police Commissioner are institutional child abusers. Please reply with a date when arrest shall be made. And this was followed up by another email, which will take you through. It says, Dear Mr. Brighton, as per my previous email of the 30th of May 2018, you're not the complainant in this matter, and unless you're able to provide written consent from the complainant that they're happy for you to act on their behalf, I will no longer be communicating with you. This is just outstanding stuff. So the caseworker replies for the Police and Crime Commissioner. We spoke to her this morning. She was unsure if the Police and Crime Commissioner was even aware of this particular child abuse case or had seen the evidence. But clearly, from what she said to us over the phone, she and the Office of the Police and Crime Commissioner is more concerned with data protection than receiving evidence showing the abuse of children. David, this is astonishing stuff, because if anybody is sitting there thinking, well, thanks to Rotherham and Rochdale, we've now got the police and authorities doing the right things. Oh no, the cover-up goes on, the same institutional cover-up, and there can only be one reason for this. Individuals, we don't know who those individuals are at the moment, within the system, the child protection system, the police system, the local authority, they are protecting paedophile rings. There can be no doubt about this.
This is exactly what all of the people who campaign for Holly Gregg in Scotland are familiar with. You have only 3 answers that will come back from the government. Here is a photocopy of some legislation that's already on the internet. Here is an address for another part of government because you're talking to the wrong people, or go away, right? Thank you for your correspondence, and it's been filed and we'll not talk to you anymore. Now, the data protection angle is a somewhat new one, but it's becoming very popular as a way of saying no. Now, one of the other things is when you complain, when you raise a concern, what then happens? That concern goes straight to the most inappropriate person in the entire state apparatus. If it's a police officer not doing his job and not protecting a vulnerable child from horrendous abuse, and you bring that to the attention of the authorities, the first thing that will happen is that police officer will be informed. In most cases, the police officer himself or herself will be the person responding on behalf of the state. And then you try to go to the regulators, the oversight, the various levels of protection built in by the state to look after you, the citizen, and make sure that the state does its job. And this standard of response, namely, well, we can't talk about specifics, please go away. This is standard. This is what you get. It's everywhere.
And there can be only one answer for it, and that is that the state is the lead authority on facilitating and covering up the abuse of children. Let's look at this police and crime commissioner. Here he is. Dr. Alan Billings. Now, he's a Labour Party candidate. He's well embedded in the Labour Party. So the Labour Party is now implicated in what's going on here. But he says, you put your faith in me by electing me as your Police and Crime Commissioner in 2014. I ask that you do that again, which people did. They re-elected him. He goes on, police trust was shaken. The police were in shock at what was revealed. He's talking about Rotherham here. I said that confidence could only be rebuilt if the police acknowledged past mistakes, improved their practice and brought prosecutions. And what do we have? The very same man, ignorant. He may be totally ignorant of this evidence, as the young lady has suggested, or he's absolutely aware of it and he's now part of the cover-up. But we did a little bit more research, and it doesn't take much to find there are other questions being asked over this man. Here we have with the Yorkshire Post, controversy over Yorkshire Police SARS 31,500 appointment. And what did he do? He appointed the wife of his election agent to the assistant police commissioner job. I would say rank hypocrisy. People use some pretty strong words in describing it. Somebody here said it stinks. Sheffield Lib Dem councillor Joe Otten said the appointment stinks. But this is the standard of what's actually happening with child abuse investigations. And let's remind ourselves, Melanie Shaw, airbrushed by the BBC, the lady who exposed the abuse in Beechwood. But what I found this morning was a 2011 report from the BBC where they said the police had said there were no arrests and they were keen to squash rumours of digging going on at the site of the former home. Now, of course, the police said that because the UK column challenged the police and asked them whether they'd carried out full forensic examination of the site. And they said to us, no, but we did dig a hole. So the BBC pumping out the lies, the spin, the misinformation. Meanwhile, Melanie Shaw is locked up. The local authority, well, what did they do? They demolished the home and redeveloped the site. Let's get rid of the evidence pretty quickly. And I'll leave you that when children's records were discovered on site, the persons discovering those records were then threatened by the police that if they didn't keep their mouths shut, there was going to be big trouble. So that is the state of the United Kingdom 2008 under the leadership of Treason May, Conservative, but as you've seen, all of the parties are implicated in this cover-up of the abuse of children.
As a final point on this, you say that the Police and Crime Commissioner may not be aware of the case himself, but it is his regime in that office, and if he has made a statement in order to get himself elected, which says, well, we've got to change the culture and approach these problems differently. Well, he clearly has not changed the culture within his own organisation.
Mike, you saw my face when I made the telephone conversation because you would have thought the Police and Crime Commissioner would be falling over himself to speak to somebody who said there's video evidence of the abuse of a child. But what I got was a young lady. I accept that young lady was doing the best she could. But this is it, isn't it? People who are put in a very difficult position dealing with the public. Meanwhile, the big people hide in the background. So I've got quite a lot of sympathy for that young lady, but she clearly did not realise the significance of what she was saying to me. Whose fault is that? Not hers. That's Dr. Alan Billings. And if people are really picking up on this segment and the importance of it, can we ask that you might like to contact Dr. Alan Billing and ask him very politely and nicely why he and South Yorkshire Police are refusing to look at the evidence of child abuse? That's the simple question, and you can quote this programme.
Okay, this is on screen at the moment, Lord Keane of Ely, if I've pronounced that right. David will correct me in a second if I'm wrong. Well, he was talking all about sovereignty yesterday, the rule of law and the role of law officers in the Scottish Parliament, and Scottish Government, rather. He said it's essential that the law officers are champions of the rule of law within government, and it's equally important that you are given reassurance that we fulfil that role. The duty of the law officers is to ensure that the government acts lawfully at all times, that is, that ministers act within the law and civil servants stay within the law. He said law, in particular statute law, is the instrument of government. It is perhaps the primary means governments have of giving effect to policy. And in seeking to uphold the rule of law, I try to ensure that all legislation the government prepares meets the requirements of legal certainty. The law should operate in a clear and predictable manner where possible. In this tradition, Lord Reid, he said, stated plainly in AXA General Insurance, with reference to the Lord President's remarks, that I quote, "The Scottish Parliament is not a sovereign parliament in the sense of that Westminster can be described as sovereign. Its powers were conferred by an Act of Parliament, and those powers being defined are limited." Well, this is quite a spectacular statement that he's quoting here, David, because, of course, what he's intimating there, what he's implying, is that the powers of the UK Parliament are not limited. Well, I think we fought a civil war in this country over the idea of a divine right of kings, and now we seem to have a divine right of Parliament, because this is completely ignoring the constitutional arrangements that we have in this country.
It's a fascinating little talk, this, and I would suggest to people, if you look it out, it's well worth the 5 or 10 minutes it'll take to read it in full. It's all concerning public law. Now that's the law that governs the interaction between the state and the individual, and the fact that there is such a thing immediately points to the fact that it's an unequal relationship, and that we have people who are in privileged positions. Unlike the king at one point, there's no privileged persons in the same way, but there's privileged positions, which is almost worse because they have a little loan of the power. And then there's all this law which is building up to, well, to do what? And that's the thing that I found most fascinating about this. He says here, he says, if the rule of law is to be disrespected and falls into disrepute, elected governments will not be able to govern effectively. Any government is simply shooting itself in the foot if it undermines the rule of law. When faced with proposals made by my colleagues, the implication there is unlawful proposals. I ask them to consider not just what they would wish to achieve in the short term, but to reflect upon what the next government might do in their shoes, and thereby place these proposals into context. There's no context of first principles, right and wrong. There's no context of the law deriving from something beyond power here. It's a very worrying little example. Now, he goes on, he talks about the duty of candour, which applies to government ministers, but only in court, right? In court, and only in court, they have a duty to be transparent and not to withhold significant information. In short, not to dissemble in any way. The duty of candour applies to all those who derive their authority from public law. So they're deriving their power from this legal system. And then he quotes Lord Donaldson, and he says that the administrator of a public law court has created a new relationship between the courts and those who derive their authority from public law, one of partnership based on a common aim, namely the maintenance of the highest standards of public administration. So the courts are in partnership, expressly here, in partnership with the government.
What happened to the sense of an independent judiciary?
It's gone. I don't know. I mean, no one asked us. It just seems to have vanished. What the point they're making here is that the government requires a certain amount of throw weight, and it has to be accepted on some level by the population, right? And the way that they get the combination of coercive power, but coercive power that someone will still accept, is through the law, is through public law. And the reason this is counterfeiting. It's like the way that when government prints fiat money, right? It prints bits of paper, and people believe it has value because once way back in history, it did. It represented gold or silver or something tangible, something that had real value. And the government carries on counterfeiting this based on the respect that the public have for the original thing. Now, the law meant something in this country. The law was originally something that protected people. It protected people from being plundered. It protected the weak from the rich, right? And now it's an instrument of plunder. It's an instrument where the weak are abused by the rich. But because it's the law, it still has the kudos and people are accepting it. That's what he's saying here, not in quite so many words, but that's the implication. And he's quite explicit about what powers we're talking here. He says the executive arm of the government wields power over the most intimate and personal aspects of the lives of every single person in the country. Our homes, our families, our jobs. Faced with the fearsome responsibility of exercising the full coercive powers of government, we should actually be grateful that the courts are there to offer guidance and set boundaries. But remember why they're doing it, all in the interest of good administration and keeping the show on the road.
Well, look, just come back to this quote a little second, because he's talking about the powers of the Scottish Parliament being limited by statute, but perhaps the UK Parliament, it infers the UK Parliament is not. When I sent this to the usual group this morning, Alex Thompson came back and said the same assertion was made by 3 judges in the inner court at the hearing which David and Robert attended recently. Towards the end of the transcript, one of the Lord Justices says that if there is one constitutional principle in the United Kingdom above all others, it is that Westminster is sovereign and that this trumps even treaties. So I just wondered if you had any comments about that, because that is a hugely spectacular statement for any judge to make.
It is astounding. Now, my understanding of the meaning was Westminster is sovereign in that Westminster can do anything Westminster decides to do within its own building. It can say what it likes. It's not bound by any external party saying, well, you're not allowed to look or legislate or talk about a certain issue. So it's free within the bounds of its own building. But this is one of these areas where words have more than one meaning, and there's movement, right? Because the people are sovereign, and if the Parliament is sovereign, if that starts to be the same sort of way, if the sovereignty of the people becomes simply the sovereignty of the Parliament, then the people have lost something very significant. The people have become slaves.
Absolutely. Now, I said a second ago that we have fought a civil war in the past over this notion of divine right of kings. We clearly, Parliament considers that they now have a divine right, no limits on their power, no limits on anything that they do. This can't end well, I suggest.
It can't end well. Just one other quick quote from this paper here. So he's quoting a chap, Lord Reid. Courts exist, Lord Reid explains, to ensure that the laws made by Parliament and the common law created by the courts themselves, spot the mistake there, are applied and enforced. So it's very much an enforcement arm here. And he carries on, people must have unimpeded access. I love it. It doesn't say free access because we know it's not free. Without such access, laws are liable to become a dead letter. The work done by Parliament may be rendered nugatory, and the democratic election of members of Parliament may become a meaningless, may become a meaningless charade. That is why the courts do not merely provide a public service like any other. So, and he's talking with somebody, he's getting at a larger truth there, that it's through the court system that the political system gathers any sort of a moral authority. And it's all borrowed from the idea of law, the older idea of law, where you don't cause loss or harm to your neighbour, you don't use fraud in your contract, you behave in an honourable and decent way. That idea is being borrowed by the politicians, and through the legal system they are stealing our freedom and our sovereignty from under our noses, and the courts are colluding with it.
Yeah. Yes. Okay, well, look, we're absolutely out of time, David, but I just want to do two things. First of all, remind everybody that Reverend Andrew Ashdown is speaking in Frome in Somerset next Friday. Please get along to that if you possibly can. And then, David, I need to jump forward a bit on the graphics just to show the Fresh Start Foundation, but just give us an update on the Fresh Start Foundation, if you could, while I get that graphic up.
Well, yes, the next one is we're a quarter of the way through the 36 Roadshow program, and the next one is one of the biggies. It's Robert Greene, and it's in Aberdeen. And anyone who knows the history will realise why that is. Many things. It will be wonderful. It will be a very memorable event, and I think we'll have a very large turnout for that. So please come along. It's in the Station Hotel in Aberdeen. 11 till 3 on Saturday the 23rd, so Saturday week. And Robert will have a lot to say about everything he's been doing in recent years and everything he's learned. And we'll have a very special event, I'm sure.
Okay,
excellent. Well, David, thank you very much for joining us. I'll just end with a note and said I had a conversation with a gentleman this morning who was talking about people waking up, what they knew, and he said, my opinion, I think there's been a step change in the knowledge out there. So people, instead of just being excited about one particular subject, are beginning to migrate across to learn about other things, whether it's common law or our proper constitution. But knowledge is starting to spread through groups of people. And I think this is very exciting. It's what needs to happen. But of course, with the knowledge of what's happening to us, it's so important that we do things, we do something. It's not enough to be an observer. We are required to act. And I'm just going to say, if anybody feels that they can challenge South Yorkshire Police, challenge that police commissioner about the case where they've been provided the video evidence and the audio evidence of abuse, but they're doing nothing. They already have the evidence, so don't let them put you off by saying what evidence. They've already got it. If we can do simple things in a polite, reasonable way, we can bring huge pressure to bear. It's up to us. There is no them that's going to do the job for us. We'll leave you with that thought over the weekend. Thanks very much for joining us. We'll be back at the same time on Monday. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.